Okay, so we come to the challenge of decolonization. In a way, we already handled that. And it was the fact that the mission stations did not only have hospitals or clinics, they also had schools. And in those schools, as they were teaching the Africans were beginning to realize that there is no difference between us and our Western colonizers. We are actually the same. We are all made in God's image, and therefore why should we be ruled by them? And especially that a number of them were actually sent abroad to those same countries for further education. So when they came back, they basically had realized we are the same, and therefore they began to agitate for change. I mentioned the fact that this atmosphere that was there within the society and the community backfired into the churches as well, because the indigenous leaders were also beginning to raise similar questions, especially in those structures where you had entire denominations. So they were then also beginning to ask the question, well, why are we not the ones leading? Because we've got the qualifications and everything else, and so even there, the pressure began to mount. And all this is now in, I would say, roughly between about 1920, 1930, all the way to about 1960, 1970. So it's about a 50-year period in the last century when all this was happening. It's amazing that once upon a time, since I lived in the 20th century, I used to say in this century. Now I'm saying in the last century. It sounds very awkward. And so finally, the international missionaries were pressurized to start handing over denominations to indigenous leaders. Some did it willingly, others did it by force, primarily because it was becoming impossible to lead because of the atmosphere that was there on the outside. I was mentioning to you yesterday or the day before that my heroine in the faith is the Lady Olive Carey Dock. When she was the only missionary remaining in the original place where Baptist work began, she made the move of the indigenous leader, the primary indigenous leader of the church at the mission station to become the primary leader of the mission itself. Now that was extremely rare at that time. So in 1931, now the pressure was beginning to mount a little later. In 1931, Paul Kasonga, the gentleman who had no feet and no hands, became the primary leader of the work. Then 3 years later, in 1934, another leader was added who was actually his assistant pastor at the church to become the assistant leader of the mission work. And it wasn't the only place at that time where there was Baptist work. There was a place where the work spread, and thankfully they also accepted that leadership. So you had a situation now where the primary leaders of the Baptist work in Zambia were these two indigenous leaders, and under them were the missionaries as well. That meant that when the pressure was beginning to mount in the 40s, into the 50s, into the 60s, for Baptist work, at least in that particular denomination, there was no pressure at all because the leaders had taken over. However, it took another 20 years before these leaders were ordained as pastors as such from South Africa. Took another 20 years. So they were only ordained in 1953. That's when they were finally made actual reverends, to borrow the terms that were being used. And then Paul Kasonga himself died the following year in 1954. So he only functioned under that title in that 1 year. Then when the new governments took over after the colonial governments had been removed, a lot of these countries took over the mission schools, the mission hospitals, the mission colleges, and so on. Part of the reason was because their banks, their central banks were full of money. And so they thought they could run literally everything themselves. Part of it was just the excitement. We've taken over, let's also take over these institutions as well. So that took place. However, over years, the quality of education, the quality of health care really plummeted. And the demands from the people themselves were that please hand over. The churches were doing a better job. And that's how a lot of these institutions were handed back to the churches. Finally, national bodies began that divided churches, and I'm talking about Protestant churches here, into liberals and evangelicals. And these are national bodies, primarily because of the gospel. There was a recognition that we need to unite, but we can't unite with everybody just because they claim to be Protestants, because a lot of the churches had just gone liberal. They were social churches. You were in the church because your parents were born in that church and so forth, rather than the fact that you had come to repentance and faith in Christ. So the evangelicals also then began their own bodies. So in a lot of countries in Africa, you have the Roman Catholics have their own body altogether. Then you have the liberals have their own body, and then you also have the evangelicals having their own body. Now, inside them, you'll have a lot of smaller bodies as well. But generally speaking, that's what you find around Africa, largely speaking. I want to quickly move on to the situation today, because that's where we really need to end. Okay? First of all, Africa continues to be a place of disasters. Civil wars, generally speaking at the moment, it's not as much as it's been across the 20th century. At this stage, which part of Africa, which country in Africa is destabilized? The Congo to a large extent, yeah. Somali, Sudan, they've now divided. There's a little bit more peace. Which place? Libya. I don't know why that has gone past me. I know, yes, when Gaddafi was removed, there was quite an upheaval, and I've just lost contact with news from Libya. Yeah. So there's been a little more rest, but generally speaking, that's the way it's been. AIDS also had its devastating effect towards the end of the 20th century. So in terms of leadership in nations, there were quite a number of coups across the continent of Africa. Not so much now. I think democracy seems to be gaining ground a lot more. Having said that, however, there's been phenomenal growth of the church. I am not sure of any other continent on the globe that is having as much a growth of the Christian church as is happening on the African continent. And that's one reason why I rejoice in being in Africa at this stage. Because as my previous pastor used to say, he says, I would prefer to struggle with controlling fire than trying to set an ice block afire, is what I mean. Trying to get where there is coldness and trying to warm that up. I would rather there's fire and then I'm trying to give it some shape so that it doesn't destroy other things. And that's basically what is happening in Africa. There's phenomenal growth. The problem, why I've added that but, is what we hear of the Christian church being a mile wide and an inch deep. There is very, very little doctrinal understanding and biblical knowledge. Very, very little. It's almost an epidemic across the continent. And also because you can easily become a pastor in Africa. Very easy. You just decide to become one. And before long, you will have at least 50 to 100 people following after you. And it becomes a means of earning money. So we have too many individuals, especially in our densely populated neighborhoods, where they've now become pastors with nothing to be said for them. Thankfully, there's also been a lot of evangelical work in education institutions, and that's very healthy. By that I mean if you go to colleges and universities, even schools, I don't know what it is like here in Ethiopia, but in Zambia, I mean, that's a ripe field. It's a ripe field. You can go to any university and begin preaching the gospel there, and you easily draw a crowd. They want to listen to you. They might challenge you, but they won't be angry and try to get rid of you. So my own church, for instance, does a lot of university work, a lot of it. When we were speaking last evening, and I was talking about so many young people that have come into our church just in the last 2 to 3 years, it's largely from the university campuses because of the amount of outreach work that we are doing there. So it's generally true in a lot of African countries, whereas in a lot of Western countries, you just don't dare attempt to do something like that. And we're still in Asian countries, you lose your head if you attempt to convert people from their religion and so forth. But therefore, Africa is an open field in that sense, very, very open. The phrase here, other forms of leadership training are being experimented with. It's the fact that the Western form of Bible college training, which is partly what we're doing here, although not quite because of the fact that this is like a one-year course. So this again might fall into this new category. But the form where you sort of leave wherever it is you live and work and go and be trained for 4 to 5 years to get your degree, and then sort of add on more and then get ordained and so on. It's like too slow for the galloping horse. There's just so much spiritual activity happening that it's just been understood we need to spread out. We need to do whatever we can in order to bring in as many students as possible. So for instance, back home in Zambia, I'm involved with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colleges plus the university, and we have a total of roughly 120 students at any one time undergoing training at certificate, diploma, degree, and master's level. And it's simply because you just have to spread out. So what we've done among ourselves is that you major in specific courses and then you go around like that. So that way the colleges are not paying you any salary because you're paid by your church. And then when it's your turn, you pack your bags and you go off to go and do a block class here. And then from there, you go, next time you are called upon, it's there, you go and do your block class there, and so on. So we've shared out courses, and it just makes theological education more accessible. And then just to give it a sense of worth, we connect those courses with other institutions outside the country so that there is some, people are saying, okay, this degree is from this college, but also seconded by an international college either in South Africa or America or something, and so forth. And some of those lecturers also come and join us for some of the block classes. So just multiplying that. There are a lot of just preaching courses, just on preaching alone, how to prepare and deliver expository sermons, workshops and seminars all over the place that are being done right across Africa, to just try and catch up with this galloping horse, because otherwise we're going to have a lot of erroneous teaching going around. So there's a lot of that that's taking place in Africa at the moment. In a lot of the newer churches, there is still the whole process of handing over to indigenous leadership as well. So that's still ongoing. The use of media is still very much foreign to us. And I think that's something that we need to catch up on as the African church. Previously, it was very costly because you had to pay to put your stuff on TV and on radio and so forth. But now with the internet, it's a lot cheaper. But still, we are very much behind our Western brethren. When you look at our church websites, they really still need to be modernized. It's as if they were picked out of Noah's Ark or something. They are not user-friendly and so forth. Even with respect to the use of social media like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and so on, all these things that are coming up, we are still tying our shoelaces as churches. Our young people who are onto these platforms, all they are doing is, and so on. You say, yeah, so what? If people see you with a peace sign, what's that doing? Or they see your backside, what will that really do to them? So we are still very much lagging behind. That's one reason why I was very excited to become part of the Gospel Coalition Africa. It was primarily because it was an instrument that will then get the gospel, give it a platform across the continent. And we're now hitting about 1 million hits a year, which is great. But we can do much more. It's the shop floor for information. So that's, again, something that is going on, but we are behind. And then missions work is yet to take off at a serious level. I think the African church still thinks we are the end of the pipe. So it's my church should grow by more conversions and more people joining us, rather than thinking that it's a baton that we have received to pass on, and therefore we should multiply ourselves. That's a lot. There's a lot that needs to be done there. I often joke in Zambia that you can call any pastor to come to your church and speak on missions, and they'll come and do an excellent job. Then when you now ask that same pastor what they are doing in missions, zero. So somehow we've got it in our brain that missions is part of our work. Matthew 28 is there. But we keep postponing this thing that, missionaries are white people, not us, the white people. They come from outside and they come to do work here, instead of seeing ourselves as being part of the process and therefore planting other churches. Let me throw in a few more things that are not on this screen, but that I picked up while I was teaching the same material elsewhere. In terms of where we are, there's the whole process of democratization is an ongoing phenomena on the African soil. You can't miss it. Kenya is right now voting, or they've just voted, and we're expecting the results. What is it looking like? It's very close. That's what I keep hearing, just that little phrase, very close. So we'll see what happens. Then countries in Africa are coming together in huge blocks. In fact, I'm told that one of the things that's happening right now is they want to do away with passports on African soil. I can't wait for that day to come, that you just use your national whatever card to go from one country to the other. So let's hope that happens. And the good thing with things like this, we don't think about it, but it aids the work of the gospel the moment you become a bloc. As I said when we just began, the gospel normally moves with empire. It's enabled by the political, economic context. Countries that are stronger economically end up being the ones that send out missionaries the most. And also, when it becomes an empire, like the Roman Empire, the gospel spreads easier because travel becomes a lot easier. It's not hindered by things. So all these things are happening in our generation, which is great for all of us. Sadly, also speaking on the negative side, has been the growth of corruption in almost every sector of society. That continues to grow, and therefore the rich are getting richer, and sadly the poor are getting poorer. I spoke about the mushrooming of, no, I didn't talk about it. I just said the Christian church being an inch thick. The mushrooming of the deliverance type of movement. Breakaways, heresies, ministries, and so on. It's become an epidemic across the continent that we are currently in. I've talked about the rising levels of poverty, but at the same time, there's been a growth of the middle class. I hope we've noticed that I don't know about Ethiopia, but where I am in Zambia, when I became pastor in 1987, nobody in my church owned a car. Nobody. We were all jumping on buses to get to church. Within a short time, we had like 2 or at the most 3 guys who were driving company vehicles. They were not their own. They were driving company vehicles. Fast forward to today, we normally have about 500 to 600 people in church, and we have roughly about 80 to 90 cars parked outside. And a lot of our people are middle class. A lot of they own houses, they own their own cars. Yeah, so you can't miss the trajectory, the change that has happened over the years. Then there is, there was one more thing that I skipped, and it is the technological advancement, but that goes on with media as well. But it's the Africa we live in today. When I first, I write for a newspaper. In fact, the editor just sent me a message saying, hey, your article is overdue. But when I first began writing for a newspaper was in 1990. I used to type on an ordinary typewriter, jump onto my bicycle. I used to cycle as a means of transport for the first 7 years. I jump on my bicycle, go to where the newspaper place is, hand in the script. And every time the newspaper was published and I read it, it was full of mistakes because the copy typist was making mistakes. Fast forward a little bit, I then began sending through faxing. You remember days of faxes, yes. So I would do it on my computer and then fax. Or there were still mistakes on the other side because the guy would get it and still type it out. But at least I wasn't having to cycle, all the way to the newspaper place. So there was a bit of progress. And then came in email. And it was wonderful now because I would type and bang. And all that they did on the other side was to copy, paste. And so it was a delight to now read my articles. And if I see a mistake and get angry, when I go to check the original, it was actually my mistake. And so I would go, ouch, I better check better next time. So there definitely was a great movement. But even then, adding to that now is I can go now anywhere in the world and I have access to internet because of the growth of Wi-Fi, that I now work on the go, so to speak, work on the go. Okay, so it just changed everything. I am able to work on the go because of technology, which means we should be more productive than the previous generation was. We should be. We should be a lot more productive because we can now do so much through the growth of technology. We can put our sermons on the internet, and as you know, a lot of guys are coming to the Reformed faith through downloading John Piper, John MacArthur, Paul Washer, and so on, and it's just incredible. I told you about the example of that lady who for 1 year was actually growing in the knowledge of the things of God in a Muslim home, putting earphones and downloading sermons. So there's so much more, therefore, that we can do. Okay, we are living in days of opportunity. I want us to wrap up now by going around this room and saying to ourselves, the African church, we began even before the New Testament was closed. We've reached today. I've even squeezed in Ethiopia for good measure. Okay, let's listen to just one thing that has impacted you the most, that you would love to go home with. Okay, so any three things, just take note of them. The one thing. And if you have any other questions at the end, we'll provide an opportunity. Yeah, I definitely would like to echo that, because no human society can ever go forward where education is backward. You can't. We build on previous knowledge. That's how development happens to the glory of God. And even the non-believers do that. But where it is Christian, it glorifies God. So we really need to be very deliberate about it. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yeah. Again, that's vital, because you remember the Reformation. It largely took place because the printing press had just been discovered. The same thing with the Reformation that's now sweeping across Africa. It's really the internet. But again, it's other people using it more instead of us. And yet the baton has now come to us, and we need to make sure that we do better. Yeah. Thank you. The next two. Okay? A lot of it, yes. Thank you. And definitely the issue of writing and reading is something that we cannot overemphasize, which ties in with the education element that was mentioned as well, and media and so on. We really need to change that attitude in order for us to be productive. I often imagine, you know how difficult it was in the first century for us to even have this Bible, because there was no printing press. Imagine Luke sitting down and beginning to research what had really happened in the days of Jesus and also in the early part of the church, and beginning to write that down. He didn't have a laptop. It was a quill and a scroll that he was writing, slowly, writing. There was no duplication facility. It then later on had to be individuals like yourselves to whom the dictation was being done, and those things were being written. But imagine Luke alone writing. The fruit of it over 2,000 years. We can do the same. We ought to do the same, to make sure that we are writing and reading. James. Amen. And that's something we really need to work into our churches. We really need to work into our children when we marry and we have children, because this victim attitude is something they can easily go with into adulthood, as if now the world owes them something, when really they ought to be world changers themselves through the gospel. And it cripples productivity and transformation and so forth. So, yeah, thank you very much for that. And again, to say it's the responsibility we have today. The baton has come to us. Yes, the media will continue its narrative. You hear it all the time. It will also be in social media as people are commenting about things. But we need to see from a biblical worldview, a gospel-centered. Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that's one thing the church history teaches you. Because as you are reading, you discover the same great guys made mistakes, but they contributed positively. And so you say, well, then I don't need to wait until we really have this thing sorted out perfectly. Let me do what I can now in my time, in my gifts, in my place, and so on. Excellent. I love that, those two things. Yeah. On one hand, the media of the printed page, and then also making sure that we have good, healthy churches. The lampstands, which will continue radiating the light. Yeah. You know, speaking about what you said, which is amounting to what Aid said about being intentional, so that we are spreading. My own experience in Zambia, our church within Lusaka itself, we've planted 6 churches within Lusaka. Every time we plant a church, you can see spaces in the congregation because, you know, we say, okay, you guys who live that side, can you sort of work together to support the person that we've sent there? And once membership is established, if you want, you can come back. Usually about maybe 1/10 of the people that go there come back, but 9/10 remain there. But the point I want to mention is this. Literally, within 6 months to a year, that space is gone again. It's occupied by other people. And it's phenomenal that initially, the only time I really worried was when we started the church in the area where our big givers, you know, the managers and managing directors and so on, where they live. We started a church there. And I remember thinking afterwards when I said, okay, you guys who live there, you know, concentrate there. And then the following Sunday, I noticed that, you know, it's these big earners that have gone. And I remember thinking to myself, will the church afford my salary after this? You know, you sort of worried a little bit. But again, in due season, those spaces get filled up. We still had to break down walls and extend our church auditorium. And now, if I was to say, those 6 churches add up the number of people who are in your churches on a Sunday morning, and then I add ours, there's absolutely no way we can accommodate those people in one building. Out of question. If we had not been church planting, we probably would still be maybe a little more, but definitely not those numbers. So, when the Bible says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, that multiply in the middle makes sense. And if we are not multiplying, and we are all just like the way Jerusalem was at first, just enjoying nice, warm fellowship, that's it. In fact, we'll even start fighting each other now. But once you send people off, it's amazing. The other bit is this. The guys who are now elders in those churches that we've planted within Lusaka, there's no way they would have been elders by now in our church because, you know, they would have been just enjoying the ride in the back seat. You see, the other people who are elders. But when now they were sent off, they had to look at one another and say, guys, we better grow up because we are really the ones who are leaders here. And I've often joked with them because when they put on social media that one of them was preaching, I often write to that person to say, you mean you were sitting here in the pew and you could preach like that? You know, they had to rise to the occasion. So I very much agree with you. When, as churches, we begin to see that this is our responsibility, we actually will not be losers in the end. We will multiply and we ourselves will grow and the work will grow. Thank you very much. Finally, Yeb. Yeah. Yeah, I think the point there is that we need to be faithful and we need to remain faithful. Because as we are faithful and remain faithful, in due season the ministry grows. And it begins to impact beyond your immediate environment. But it's by remaining faithful. And the Lord continues opening doors. Remain faithful to your very dying day. That means your personal sanctification must be number one. Because once you stop growing yourself spiritually, that's it. You begin to get corrupted on the inside, and the end is near. So to ensure that you are continuing to grow yourself in terms of your marriage, in terms of your children, and so on, again, making sure that that's your first congregation. Because again, if you fail in the home, you know, what are you doing on the outside there? So that then becomes your second area. And then as we're learning, healthy churches. So making sure that your church is healthy enough to be a base for further growth and so forth. So just making sure that we are faithful in those, and then the Lord enables the work to go further. And then I agree with you, being also intentional with respect to further work. I think part of it is the maturing of the church as well. When your local church simply is interested in you preaching and they're not interested in anything else, your ministry does not grow. But when your church leaders, your fellow leaders, see your gifts and they say, look, let's provide the means by which this brother's gifts can be utilized further, you find that you don't need to start your own little ministry, because the church itself sees itself as a lampstand shedding light further afield. I mentioned, no, it wasn't in this group, it was the meeting we had yesterday in the evening, that there was a time in my own church when I almost quit. Somebody, one of the leaders, really wanted me out. In fact, I even wrote my letter of resignation. But, you know, one or two of the leaders came and stopped me from submitting it. But having survived that, one of the things that the church did was, even prior to that moment, recognize that there was a ministry I had that goes beyond the local church. And they therefore employed a lady to be my office assistant. Not church secretary, but my office assistant, so that administrative things, I just was throwing them onto her table. So all I'm saying to all of you here is, it was David who mentioned it, grow a healthy church and let the ministry grow out of that, rather than you trying to run it yourself in terms of your own calling. The church also has a full-time missions coordinator. Again, just making sure that all the missionaries, when they are contacting, saying we need this and we need that, and then, you know, it's just being forwarded to that person, and he's doing it full-time. And hence, our ability to have so many churches planted. Okay, so missions work is now with us. let's make sure we do it right. Let's make sure we are faithful and we get it done. Okay?